I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
We know him now as an icon of human rights. Martin Luther King, the dreamer, champion of racial justice, oracle and visionary of a better society.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But there's another side to this man, a side that's in danger of being forgotten.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war.
King, the apocalyptic seer, the raging prophet of God's judgment on America and Western culture.
God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. If you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power.
King, the preacher of salvation to a lost world.
What I'm saying today is, America, you must be born again.
Mary Jo Smiley was a newly married member of Dexter and remembers Martin Luther King settling in as its minister.
I met him, but he did not impress me at all. I don't know whether I should say that. But the first time I went to church to hear him, he mesmerized me.
The first real test of his leadership came a few months later when King found himself embroiled in a struggle that went well beyond the confines of his church. The arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery bus had sparked a widespread protest in the black community. Much to his surprise, King found himself elected leader of a citywide bus boycott.
You must remember that Martin didn't come to Montgomery to lead a boycott. He came to Montgomery to be the pastor of Dexter. And all of a sudden, he was just thrust into that position.
But King's oratory at the mass meetings electrified his audiences and encouraged them to believe that anything was possible.
If that man had told me to dance in a fire, I would have walked right in it and tried to dance.
When Martin Luther King came here and began his ministry, do you think at any point he decided he'd got out of his depth?
Well, there was a critical point in early January, late January of 1956, right after the bus boycott would have started.
How old was he?
He would have been about 26 years old.
So he's a really young man.
Quite young. And that particular evening, he got a call late that night, about midnight. And he had received threats in the past, but this one just somehow really agitated him to the core of his being.
King later recalled this experience in one of his sermons.
But I never will forget one night, very late. The telephone started ringing and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. That voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're gonna blow your brains out and blow up your house."
After he received the phone call, he came into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee, just trying to recollect himself. You can imagine the experience was such a moving and profound experience. He was just literally gripped with fear. I mean, his life had been threatened. And he sat here and he felt like giving up.
And I got to the point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. Something said to me, you gotta call on that something, and that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way. I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself.
When King first decided to follow in his father's footsteps, he may well have thought he was just entering the family business. But whatever happened that night in Dexter Parsonage, by his own admission, King now felt called to fulfill a special mission from God. And it enabled him to lead the bus protesters to a great victory in Montgomery. After a year-long protest, the city authorities were forced to desegregate the buses. King now emerged as the leader of a new kind of movement, one that was prepared to confront racial evil with non-violent resistance. And many African Americans now began to see his leadership in religiously charged, almost messianic terms. This extraordinary mural in the hall at Dexter Avenue was painted by local artist John Fagan.
After being a student here at Alabama State and attending this church, and Reverend King was my pastor, I wanted to commemorate some of the events that happened during the bus boycott and during his time as a leader of the civil rights movement.
How was it like for yourself during this time? What attitude did your parents have towards Martin Luther King and what he was doing here in this church?
They were afraid that something would happen to me if I participated in the movement. But once they knew the man, knew what he stood for, then they were on board with the program. Because they never had a man with this type of courage, and a man that was so humble, a man that was so loving and giving, and that was not only to his church, but to the whole community. And they loved him, and they would have followed him anywhere.
What about you?
Me too. Yes, I was in that bunch.
This is really fascinating because everybody sees Martin Luther King as an iconic figure. The minute you see an image of him, you immediately think human rights. But this goes way beyond the usual secular symbolism that we're used to. It is a religious image of a holy person or a saint, someone who inspires faith. And King himself now seems to have been unashamed to frame his mission in overtly religious terms.
God has told me that he wants freedom for his people. And I'm not going to run from the responsibility. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people, God has spoken to me.
I've come to talk to one of Dr. King's closest friends and colleagues to find out how seriously King took his theology.
Mr. Young, thank you very much for having me at your office.
Andrew Young was one of a group of radical preachers who gathered around King in the SCLC. He later went on to become US ambassador to the UN and the first black mayor of Atlanta. But in 1963, he was Martin Luther King's right-hand man and closely involved in the decision to launch a historic campaign in Birmingham, the southern bastion of racial segregation.
I think one criteria for Martin's decision was that this was something he felt that was a call of God to help his children who were less fortunate or who were in need.
I mean, I get a bit frustrated when people imply you have to do it because you're religious. You could do it because it's the right thing to do as well.
I certainly would not have been bothered with this if I had not been a religious person. All of our thinking about this was very biblical. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about Moses and the children of Israel in Egypt and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years of segregation and coming to a promised land of creative integration. I mean, these were all very biblical concepts that he believed and lived by.
In Birmingham, King persisted with peaceful protests, this time led by children. But even these provoked violent reactions from the city authorities, and King's young followers were set upon by police with dogs and hoses.
Wade in the water, come on and wade in the water, children, wade in the water.
The Birmingham campaign tested King's religious principles of non-violence to the limit. Such injustice against children provoked feelings of revenge among sections of the black community. Amazingly, King held his nerve.
We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. That is still a voice crying out through the vista of time, saying, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you.
King's Christian pacifism only infuriated the segregationists further. A number of white church leaders in Birmingham publicly denounced him as a dangerous extremist. But King turned their condemnation to his advantage. On Good Friday, 1963, he offered himself up for arrest. And from his prison cell, he penned a famous letter that in one stroke of brilliance brought whites and blacks together on the same side of the struggle. He wrote to his critics that he wanted to be, like Jesus, an extremist for love. Today, extremism has a negative connotation. What do you think he meant?
An extremist for love means that you would lay down your life not only for your friend and for your brother, but for your enemy. And in a way, he was saying that the struggle for freedom was a struggle not only to liberate black people, but white people as well. Our slogan was to redeem the soul of America. But the idea of redemption, you don't get any more religious than that. That's a clearly religious word. And to redeem the soul of a nation it's the religious concept of the 1960s.
During those mass meetings, they were always open with prayer. And our religious upbringing then caused us to really look to the Lord for guidance. We had no guns, but we had our bodies and presented our bodies non-violently.
I'm back at his old church, Ebenezer Baptist, to talk with Professor Richard Lisher about the dream. In studying King's speeches, he's found that even the most secular of them were mining deep biblical themes. And it's no accident we're meeting here.
There is a direct line from the African-American pulpit, which is usually elevated high and lifted up in the church, to that mightily elevated pulpit at the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King was addressing an America that was angry and still almost completely segregated. Instead of reading off a bill of particulars of how this has got to change tomorrow, he said instead, "It seems to me I can see something."
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
The prophet is called a seer, and in this case, I see black people and white people sitting down at the table of brotherhood and treating one another as if they were kin, because they are kin. Well, nobody had seen that. And in Hebrew scripture and in the theology of the Old Testament, once a prophet utters something from God, once the prophet has seen it and spoken it, it will happen. It will come to be. And then he quotes from the prophet Isaiah.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
The prophet announces the coming of a new day of God's righteousness and justice. And it won't be in some other universe, it will be on this earth. King believed that.
What does it mean if quite a lot of people like me have never really considered the religious aspect of Martin Luther King's speeches? I mean, do you think we're actually missing something?
You're not receiving an accurate or full portrait of Martin Luther King. I think this is the danger of a national holiday in memory of and in honor of Martin Luther King, because the United States is interested always to separate religious expression and civil expression. So there is something that is sheared off, as it were, by a secular reading of Martin Luther King. It's not the full man, it's not the whole person.
You've got to wonder where the power was. Here, the Capitol, with all the instruments of the state at its disposal, or there, across the road, at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where black folk, led by preachers, were armed with nothing more than the Bible and the strength of their convictions. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a towering achievement and a testament to King's Christian leadership of the civil rights movement. But it soon became clear that changes in the law, however important, were not enough. Taking his civil rights campaigns to towns and cities across the country, he began to voice a radical critique of the American way of life. His emphasis shifted from simple racism to the evils of poverty and greed.
It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
As a bit of a teenage revolutionary myself, I would have thought that this might be the moment when Martin Luther King began to be remembered as a champion of the left, a secular radical. I would have expected his religion to fade gently into the background. But that was the very last thing on King's mind.
They seem to forget that before I was a civil rights leader, I answered a call which left the Spirit of the Lord upon me and anointed me to preach the gospel. During the early days of my ministry, I read the Apostle Paul saying, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I decided then that I was going to tell the truth as God revealed it to me. Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant."
The pressure on King increased still further in 1967 after he publicly opposed the Vietnam War.
Unjust war in Vietnam.
President Johnson was furious at his one-time ally, and King came under even closer surveillance. In my mind, opposition to the Vietnam War was the defining image of the left in the 60s, and perhaps that's another reason why I've never seen King in religious terms. But as you examine his speeches, you're struck by the fact that the more radical his politics, the more biblical his convictions.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war as the war in Vietnam. And we are criminals in that war. We've committed more war crimes almost than any nation in the world, and I'm going to continue to say it.
King's language at this point now becomes much more judgmental. I mean, is this someone who's really raging inside?
I think King at this point really embodies the prophetic personality. King is like a modern-day Amos, or a modern-day Isaiah, or a modern-day Jeremiah. Thus saith the Lord, says the prophets of old. Now, prophet's life is not happy. There's nothing happy about being a prophet. Martin King stood in the marketplace of lies and told the truth, knowing his neck was going to get the axe. And for that reason, for the brother to stand up there and do that, it seems to me that Martin is an example of something we all can do. But he knows there's a heavy price to pay.
There's definitely a prophetic, apocalyptic quality to some of King's oratory that's impressive but also somewhat disturbing. And perhaps here we get to the heart of why King's faith is in danger of being written out of the story. In today's world, we often see religion as trouble. Far from being a solution, we see it as part of the problem. Unreasonable, divisive, militant. Aren't we more than a little bit afraid of the preacher king?
God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. Be still and know that I'm God. If you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power. And that can happen to America.
It's obvious religious commitment isn't always a force for ill, but our secular society likes to forget it can be a force for good. King believed that commitment always comes with a personal cost. And he was particularly aware of that when he campaigned in Memphis in 1968. He'd come here to support the sanitation workers in their struggle for decent conditions. And on the night of April the 3rd, he left his room at the Lorraine Motel to deliver what was supposed to be a routine address. It's come to be known as the Mountaintop Speech, his most famous after the Dream speech 5 years earlier. It also turned out to be his last.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, as he stood waiting on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, King was shot dead by a sniper's bullet. To the end, he was still working to rid America of the triple evils of racism, greed, and war, the evils that finally conspired to kill him.